Hey, what's up guys? Welcome to episode 32 of Retro Buyer's Guide. My name is Mike, and today we're going to take a look at the Atari 7800 Pro system. Now, this is a pretty interesting console release for Atari. I actually think that it's a pretty decent system for Atari had it been released when it was originally announced. And the things it does really well. However, at the time it was released, it just wasn't able to compete in the market because technology had advanced far past what it was capable of at that time. The reason being, it was announced in May of 1984. It wasn't released until 1986, so there were 2 years between. And what happened is Atari was owned by Warner Communications in 1984, and they commissioned General Computer Corporation to build and develop this Atari 7800. Well, they ended up selling the corporation Atari to Jack Tramiel, who was formerly the head of Commodore Computers, also in 1984. And Tramiel felt that Warner Communications should have to pay General Computer Corporation because the deal was made when Warner owned the company. And so he was pretty strict on that, and he let this thing sit in a warehouse for 2 years. He was mainly concentrated on Atari's 8-bit computer line, I feel like, because he wanted to compete with his former company, Commodore, who had ousted him. And so I think he put a lot of emphasis in the 8-bit computer line. And by the time the Nintendo Entertainment System had come out and this thing was released, it just wasn't able to compete. Tramiel, eventually did decide to pay up, but it was just too late. But let's talk about some of the positives. So this thing is almost fully backwards compatible with the Atari 2600, and that is fantastic. So you can go back and you can play all the classics like Phoenix here, you can play Pitfall, which is an excellent game, and hey, how about some Puyan from when Konami used to make games. So that's pretty fantastic that it's almost backwards compatible with every 2600 game. There are a few that don't work, like I believe Superchargers, Space Shuttle, and Robot Tank, depending on what board revision you have in here. But, I would say the compatibility is pretty spotless. This thing mostly was designed to do really quality arcade ports. So you got great games like Xevious here. One of my personal favorites, Food Fight, which is excellent. And maybe the best arcade game ever made, Robotron 2084. It does really great versions of those games. However, because of the backwards compatibility with the 2600, it uses the 2600 sound chip. So the games kind of sound, well, they sound like 2600 games, and the sound is not the most impressive thing about this. It's actually pretty bad. But if you can get past that, there's some really quality arcade games, and really arcade games aren't known for music anyway. They're mostly just beeps and boops, and for that purpose, this thing works pretty well. So let's look at the console a little closer here. So we have a power button on front, a pause button, which was pretty unique for Atari at the time. I think the 5200 was the first to do it, and then the 7800 carried on the tradition. You have a select and a reset button here on the other side, and here is your cartridge bay. You'll note there is no dust cover, so I usually try to keep a cartridge plugged into mine at all times. On the front here, we have 2 controller ports, and then your selector switches right here next to those. Let's look on the back. On the back we have a power all the way over here on the left. We have your channel selection switch right here, and then a regular RF out. And I will say the RF quality of the Atari 7800 is better than a lot of other consoles that rely on RF out. So that's one thing that can be said in the positive. Now, perhaps one of the best improvements of the 7800 is the controller here, which they went back to a regular standard digital joystick that is actually quite good at controlling games, unlike the non-self-centering 5200 joystick, which was prone to break. This one's much more reliable. It actually has 2 buttons too on the sides there. I will say, if you play with this thing for a while, your hand does get kind of cramped after a while because it's a little unwieldy to hold. But all in all, I would say it's a huge, major improvement over the 5200 joystick, and it was a pretty decent design at that. So. The other thing about the 7800 is it's also compatible with some other peripherals. I know in Europe they got an Atari joypad that they could use with this thing, which is basically it looks like an NES controller, and it works really well. That was never released here in the United States, which sucks, but you can import one if you want, and it works just fine. This thing is also compatible with the XG1 light gun, which came bundled with the Atari XE game system and allowed you to play light gun games. So if that's something you wanted to do on this, you can do that as well. So let's take a look at some of the games for the Atari 7800. Like I said, a lot of these are going to be mostly arcade ports, but they are good quality arcade ports, and I think if you mostly enjoy playing arcade action type games, I think you're going to love the 7800. You can pick these up for relatively cheap these days, and they're built like a tank. So let's take a look at some 7800 games. right, guys, that's going to do it for this episode of Retro Buyer's Guide. As always, thank you so much for watching. If this is your first time seeing this channel, please subscribe so you can keep up with all my latest videos. Keep leaving those likes and comments. I really do appreciate those. I'll be back soon with a new video, but until then, happy collecting.